A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Welcome to episode 1122 of My Weird Prompts. I am Korn, and today we are diving into one of the most enduring and perhaps most dangerous myths in the world of international relations. We often hear politicians stand behind podiums and declare that the bond between two nations is unbreakable, eternal, or forged in fire. We hear it most often regarding the United States and Israel, but we have heard it about the Anglo-American special relationship, the Franco-German engine of Europe, and even the now shattered alliances of the Cold War. The phrase usually cited to debunk this sentiment is often attributed to Charles de Gaulle, who supposedly said that nations have no friends, only interests. However, as any true history buff knows, that quote actually belongs to Lord Palmerston, Henry John Temple, the British Prime Minister who said it in the House of Commons back in March of 1848. He said, and I quote, "We have no eternal allies, and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." End quote. Today, on March 12, 2026, that 19th century wisdom feels more relevant than ever. We are seeing visible, jagged cracks in the Trump-Netanyahu alliance over the endgame in Iran and the humanitarian fallout in Gaza. We are seeing the United States threaten aggressive tariffs and even use annexation rhetoric against our oldest neighbor, Canada, in what the press is calling the Greenland Crisis. We are seeing Europe, led by figures like Mark Carney, pivot toward what they call values-based realism. Is the idea of a national friendship just performative rhetoric, or can these bonds actually survive the cold, hard logic of strategic interest? To help us unpack this, we have our full panel of experts and agitators. We have Herman Boppleberry bringing the data and the academic rigor. We have Raz, who I am sure has a very different theory about who is actually pulling the strings of these so-called friendships. Dorothy is here to tell us why we are all standing on the edge of a geopolitical cliff. Jacob Longman will surely find a way to tell us that everything is going to be just fine. And finally, we have Bernard Higglebottom, who has been in the trenches and seen these alliances rise and fall with his own eyes. Let us get right into it. We will start with opening statements from each of our panelists, and then we will move into a deeper debate. Herman, you have been looking at the numbers and the structural shifts. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Korn. To understand this topic, we have to move past the emotional, often flowery language of diplomacy and look at what Kenneth Waltz, the father of neorealism, described in his 1979 work, Theory of International Politics. Waltz argued that the international system is a state of anarchy, and in an anarchy, the primary goal of any state is survival. Alliances are not marriages of love, they are functional, temporary arrangements designed to balance against external threats. When the threat changes, the alliance must change, or it will become a strategic liability. We are seeing a perfect case study of this right now in March 2026. For decades, the United States and Israel shared a primary strategic interest in regional stability and countering Soviet influence, and later containing Iran. But the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace released an analysis in November 2025 that described a profound, perhaps irreversible shift. The interests are diverging. President Trump's vision of a transactional, America-first foreign policy is clashing violently with Prime Minister Netanyahu's unilateral security requirements. When we look at the history, the data shows that interest always wins. Take the Franco-Ottoman alliance. It was signed in 1536 and lasted for an incredible 262 years. It was one of the longest formal alliances in history. On paper, it was a bond between the most Christian king of France and the Islamic Caliphate. They should have been natural enemies, but they had a shared interest in countering the Habsburg Empire. It lasted until 1798, when Napoleon decided that invading Egypt was more important than maintaining the friendship. Interests shifted, and 2 centuries of cooperation vanished overnight. We see the same pattern in the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, where Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I promised eternal peace. It lasted 5 years until Napoleon marched on Moscow. My research suggests that the language of unbreakable bonds is actually a lagging indicator. Leaders use that language most fervently right when the underlying strategic alignment is beginning to decay. It is a form of diplomatic whistling past the graveyard. If you look at the current polling data we discussed back in episode 981, the generational shift in the United States regarding Israel is a statistical earthquake. The cultural affinity that once reinforced the strategic interest is evaporating. Without that cultural glue, we are left with pure realism, and pure realism says that no bond is unbreakable if the cost of maintaining it exceeds the benefit of breaking it. We are seeing this with the Greenland Crisis too. The United States sees the Arctic as a resource-rich frontier that is essential for the next century of competition with China. If Denmark and Canada stand in the way of that interest, the friendship is secondary. The data from the geopolitical graph we looked at in episode 662 confirms that we are entering a period of high friction where old alliances are being liquidated for new strategic assets.
A cold start from Herman, as expected. He is essentially saying that the more a leader talks about an unbreakable bond, the more you should check your pockets. Raz, I suspect you think there is more to these alliances than just balancing power or checking boxes in a neorealist textbook. What is your take on the reality of these international friendships?
Thanks, Korn. Look, Herman is right about the outcome, but he is completely wrong about the reason. He wants you to believe this is all just math and geography. He wants you to think it is just states acting like billiard balls on a table. But that is what they want you to think. The truth is that these alliances are not between nations at all. They are between elite networks. When we talk about the unbreakable bond between the United States and Israel, or the United States and Saudi Arabia, or even this bizarre new tension with Canada and the Greenland Crisis, we are talking about the interests of a global managerial class that moves capital across borders without any regard for the people living there. Follow the money, Korn. Why did the United States-Iran relationship under the Shah look like an unbreakable bond? We sold them our most advanced fighter jets, the F-14 Tomcat. We helped them build the SAVAC secret police. It looked permanent because the elites in Washington and the elites in Tehran were banking at the same houses. But as soon as that relationship became a liability to the global energy cartels, the rug was pulled out from under the Shah in 1979. It was not a shift in national interest. It was a shift in the agenda of the people who actually run the world. And look at what is happening now in 2026. We are being told there is a rift between Trump and Netanyahu. Is it a real rift? Or is it a scripted drama designed to allow both leaders to pursue unilateral actions that benefit their specific donor bases? Isn't it convenient that every time the public starts to question the billions of dollars in military aid, we suddenly have a public spat that makes it look like the relationship is under review? It is a shell game. The real bonds are the ones you never hear about in the news. They are the intelligence sharing agreements, the backroom tech transfers, and the deep state cooperation that continues regardless of who is in the White House or the Knesset. We talked about the Caspian Shield in episode 1133, that shadow alliance between Israel and Azerbaijan. That is a perfect example. On the surface, it makes no sense, but when you look at the drone technology and the oil routes, the real picture emerges. These unbreakable bonds are just masks for the interests of the military-industrial complex and the global bankers. They don't have friends, they have assets. And right now, the assets are being reshuffled for a new global conflict. The Greenland Crisis isn't about Denmark, it is about the lithium and the rare earth minerals that the tech giants need for the next phase of the digital panopticon. They are using the threat of annexation to force a renegotiation of mineral rights. It is a corporate takeover disguised as a diplomatic crisis.
Always tracking the money in the shadows, Raz. You're suggesting the public-facing diplomacy is just a puppet show for the real power brokers. Dorothy, you usually have a very dim view of where these shifts are leading us. When you hear about the collapse of these historical alliances, what do you see in our current moment?
I see a house of cards that is already on fire, Korn. People talk about these alliances as if they are stable structures, but history tells us they are more like weather patterns, and the storm is coming. We are living through the exact same kind of systemic breakdown that preceded the collapse of the Ottoman-British relationship or the end of the Concert of Europe. Mark my words, The rhetoric of unbreakable bonds is not just performative, it is a symptom of desperation. When a relationship is truly strong, you don't have to constantly reassure everyone that it is unbreakable. You don't see Canada and the United Kingdom constantly issuing joint statements about their unbreakable bond because it is a lived reality. The moment you start hearing those words every day, it means the foundation is rotting. We are seeing this right now with the United States and Israel. The divergence on Iran is not a minor policy disagreement. It is a fundamental break in how both nations perceive their own survival. Netanyahu is gambling that he can force the hand of the United States, and Trump is signaling that he will not be forced. This is exactly how the Franco-Russian alliance of 1892 started to unravel before World War I. They were tied together by a mutual fear of Germany, but when their individual interests in the Balkans and the colonial world began to clash, the alliance became a death trap. People aren't taking this seriously enough. If the United States-Israel relationship actually breaks, it won't be a clean divorce. It will be a chaotic, violent realignment that will destabilize the entire Middle East and likely draw in Russia and China. And look at Europe. The CNBC report from January 2026 said it clearly: as Trump destabilizes foreign relationships, Europe is forging new ties. They are moving towards strategic autonomy because they have realized that the American security umbrella is made of paper. This isn't just a shift in interests, it is the end of the post-World War II order. We are returning to a world of 19th century style power politics where every nation is a predator or prey. The Greenland Crisis is a perfect example. The fact that we are even talking about the United States pressuring Denmark or Canada over territory shows that the era of friendly democratic alliances is over. We are entering a dark age of brutal realism, and most people are still asleep at the wheel, dreaming of unbreakable bonds that have already snapped. The fading of shared cultural memories, like the direct memory of the Holocaust or the shared struggle of the Cold War, means there is no emotional buffer left. When the logic of interest says jump, there is nothing to hold the nations back from the ledge.
Dorothy, you certainly know how to paint a bleak picture. It's a world of predators and prey with the old guard falling apart. Jacob, I can see you over there practically vibrating with a counter-argument. Surely you see some hope in these international relationships. Give us the silver lining.
I certainly do, Corn, and I think Dorothy and Herman are missing the most important part of the story. They are looking at the mechanics and the failures, but they are ignoring the incredible successes where humanity has actually overcome the logic of pure realism. Look, I know it seems bad right now, and the headlines are full of friction, but here's the thing. We have proven that we can take centuries of hatred and turn them into genuine, durable friendships. The best example is the Elysee Treaty of 1963. For hundreds of years, France and Germany were what they called hereditary enemies. They fought 3 devastating wars in the span of 70 years. Realism would tell you they were destined to be enemies forever. But Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer didn't listen to the realists. They signed a treaty that didn't just align their interests, it integrated their societies. They created student exchanges, joint military brigades, and a shared economic framework that eventually became the European Union. They updated that with the Treaty of Aachen in 2019. That bond has survived the Cold War, the reunification of Germany, and multiple changes in leadership. It is more than just a strategic alignment, it is a structural peace. And look at the United States and Japan. After the most brutal conflict in the Pacific, we didn't just occupy them, we built a partnership that is now the cornerstone of security in Asia. By 1955, Japan was essentially a key part of the Western security architecture. Today, they are our closest ally in the region. That didn't happen by accident, and it wasn't just about balancing against China. It was about shared values and a deliberate choice to build something better. Even with Vietnam, as Bernard can tell you, we went from a horrific war to a relationship of substance in just 20 years. I believe the United States-Israel relationship is the same way. Yes, there is friction. Yes, interests diverge. But there is a deep, foundational affinity between our peoples that goes beyond who is in the White House or the Prime Minister's office. It is built on shared democratic values and a shared history of overcoming impossible odds. The current tensions are just a stress test. All great friendships have them. I think we will look back on this March 2026 crisis as the moment when the alliance was modernized, not when it broke. We have a way of working things out because we know that we are stronger together. The glass isn't just half full, Corn. We are building a bigger glass. The institutionalization of these bonds, through NATO, through trade pacts, through cultural exchange, creates a friction that makes breaking them much harder than the realists suggest.
I admire the optimism, Jacob. I really do. Turning hereditary enemies into partners is no small feat. But Bernard, you've been on the ground. You've reported from the summits and the war zones. You've seen these unbreakable bonds up close. Does the reality match Jacob's hope or Dorothy's doom?
It matches neither, Corn, because the reality is much more cynical and much more practical. I've covered 5 of these supposedly permanent alliances over my career, and they always end the same way, with a quiet meeting in a room where the sentiment is left at the door. I was there in 1995 when we normalized relations with Vietnam. I remember the rhetoric about reconciliation and healing. But if you were in the rooms I was in, the only word anyone was saying was China. It wasn't about friendship, it was about the fact that Hanoi and Washington both realized they had a bigger problem to their north. That is the brutal reality of what Mark Carney called values-based realism at Davos this past January. He explicitly invoked Thucydides, the ancient Greek historian who said the strong do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. That is the world we are in right now. The language of unbreakable bonds is a tool, nothing more. It is used to keep the public on board and to signal to enemies that a certain line exists. But that line is always movable. I've seen it with the British and the Ottomans. I've seen it with the United States and the Shah. I remember being in Tehran just before the fall, and the American diplomats were still talking about the Shah as our most reliable partner in the region. They believed their own press releases, and they got burned for it. Look at what is happening this month. Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom is meeting with Xi Jinping. The United Kingdom, our supposed special relationship partner, is hedging their bets because they see the United States becoming an unreliable partner under Trump's trade policies and the Greenland situation. That is not an unbreakable bond. That is a country looking at the scoreboard and realizing they need a new strategy. Even the Franco-German relationship Jacob loves so much is under immense strain. If you go to Paris or Berlin right now, they aren't talking about the Elysee Treaty. They are talking about how to survive an American withdrawal from NATO. The reality is that these bonds are only as strong as the friction required to break them. Institutionalization, like NATO or the European Union, creates friction. It makes it harder to leave. But if the pressure gets high enough, the friction doesn't matter. The U.S.-Israel relationship is currently facing more pressure than it has since the 1956 Suez Crisis. Back then, Eisenhower literally threatened to crash the Israeli economy to get them to withdraw from the Sinai. There was no unbreakable bond then, and there is no unbreakable bond now. There is only the cold calculation of what each side needs today. And today the needs are moving in opposite directions.
That is a powerful point to end our first round on, Bernard. We have a lot to chew on here. Herman says the data shows interests always win. Raz thinks it is all a show for elite interests. Dorothy sees the end of the world order. Jacob thinks we can build lasting peace through shared values. And Bernard reminds us that at the end of the day, it is all about the scoreboard. This has been a fascinating opening. We have covered everything from the 16th century Ottomans to the current crisis in the Middle East and the shifting sands of the North Atlantic. I have some sharp follow-up questions for all of you. I want to talk about whether domestic politics is the real driver here, as some realists like John Mearsheimer argue, or if there is something deeper. And I want to hear your responses to each other. We will be right back for round 2 of this discussion on My Weird Prompts. Stay tuned. All right, now that we have heard from everyone, it is time for round 2. I have some follow-up questions, and I want each of you to respond to what you have heard from the others. Let us get into it. Herman. Jacob argued that alliances like the one between France and Germany prove that we can build a structural peace based on shared values that actually transcends the cold logic of interest. You have suggested that these cultural ties are merely lagging indicators of a decay that has already begun. How do you reconcile your data with the fact that some of these integrated partnerships have successfully lasted for over 60 years?
Jacob, I appreciate the optimism, but we have to look at the underlying structural variables that allow those perceptions to exist in the first place. The LSC Treaty did not succeed because of a sudden burst of transatlantic friendship. It succeeded because the geopolitical architecture of the Cold War made conflict between France and Germany, a literal impossibility under the shadow of the Soviet threat and American hegemony. If you look at the latest working paper from the Center for Strategic and International Studies released just last month, in February 2026, it highlights that as the American security umbrella retracts, those very same old fissures in the Franco-German engine are reappearing over energy policy and defense spending. It was never about shared values alone, it was about shared fears and a lack of alternative options. When the fears change, the values are rewritten to match the new reality. Look at the U.S.-Israel relationship through the lens of John Mearsheimer. He argues that the special relationship is an anomaly driven by domestic interest groups rather than strategic logic. If that is true, then as soon as those domestic groups lose their grip, which the generational data suggest is happening, the relationship will snap back to the mean of pure realism. The institutionalization Jacob mentions is just a way to delay the inevitable.
Corn, I love Jacob, I really do, but listening to him talk about student exchanges and shared values is like listening to a brochure for a timeshare in the Cayman Islands. It sounds lovely until you realize you are being robbed. Jacob, you are talking about the wrapping paper, but I am talking about the bomb inside the box. You think the LSE Treaty was a victory of the human spirit? Follow the money back to 1963. That treaty was the formalization of the European coal and steel community. It was a merger of the two biggest industrial cartels on the continent. It was not about French and German teenagers learning each other's languages. It was about ensuring that the Thyssen and Krupp families and the French industrial elite had a unified market to sell their hardware. The glue was not friendship, Jacob. The glue was a massive, cross-border corporate profit margin protected by a private intelligence network that eventually became the foundation for the European Union. And Herman, you are closer to the mark when you talk about structural variables, but you are still missing the architects. You say these alliances are just functional arrangements for survival, but whose survival are we talking about? It is not the survival of the guy working a shift in a factory in Ohio or a kibbutz in the Negev. It is the survival of the technocratic class. Look at what Bernard said about the United Kingdom and China. He thinks it is just the British being pragmatic. No, Bernard, look at the timing. Why is Prime Minister Starmer meeting with Xi Jinping right now, in March 2026, specifically as the Greenland Crisis reaches a boiling point? It is because the transition to the petro-yuan is being negotiated in the shadows, and the City of London wants its cut before the dollar collapses. The so-called unbreakable bond between the United States and Israel is the ultimate case study. Everyone on this panel is treating the tension between Trump and Netanyahu as a real disagreement. It is a scripted drama, people. It is a public-facing distraction. While they are arguing on Twitter about Iran and the border, the actual deep state cooperation is accelerating. Have any of you looked into the Prometheus Protocol? It was a quiet agreement signed in late 2025 between the United States Department of Defense and Israeli tech firms to integrate AI-driven surveillance across the entire Mediterranean. They are building a digital panopticon while we are arguing about whether or not they like each other. Dorothy says we are standing on a geopolitical cliff, and she is right, but the cliff was built on purpose. This isn't a house of cards that caught fire, it is a controlled demolition of the old Westphalian state system. They are breaking the old alliances because they don't need them anymore. In a world of global digital currencies and satellite-based warfare, you don't need a special relationship with a neighbor, you just need a server farm and a private security contract. The language of unbreakable bonds is just the lullaby they sing to the livestock before the harvest. Realism isn't just about states, Herman, it is about the people who own the states. And right now, the owners are moving their assets to the next theater of operations. Wake up!
Dorothy, Jacob argues that the United States and Israel bond is built on a foundational affinity of shared democratic values that can weather any political storm. You have called this relationship a house of cards on fire. But if Jacob is right about the cultural and societal integration, isn't the risk of a total collapse much lower than you are suggesting?
Jacob, your faith in shared values is touching, but it is historically illiterate. You speak of the LSE Treaty as if it is a permanent shield, but you forget that values are the luxury of the secure. When the security environment shifts, when the energy grids fail, and when the populist rage boils over, those shared values vanish in an afternoon. Look at the history of the Visigoths and the Western Roman Empire. They were allies for decades, integrated into the Roman military and social structure, sharing the same Christian faith and the same borders. But when the interests diverged and the pressure from the Huns became too great, the Visigoths sacked Rome. Integration is not a guarantee of peace. It is often just a way to ensure that the eventual betrayal is more devastating. We are seeing this with the Greenland Crisis. For over a century, the United States and Canada have had the most integrated border in the world. We share a language, a culture, and a defence grid. But the moment the United States decided that Canadian sovereignty over Arctic waters was an obstacle to American energy dominance, the rhetoric turned to annexation. The shared values didn't stop the threats, they just made the threats feel like a more personal betrayal. The US-Israel relationship is in the same position. The generational decay I mentioned earlier is real. The younger generation in America doesn't share the same cultural memory of the 20th century. They don't see an unbreakable bond. They see a strategic liability that is dragging them into a regional war they don't want. When that sentiment reaches a tipping point, no amount of institutional scaffolding will save the alliance. We are returning to the Thucydidean reality Bernard mentioned. The strong do what they can. If the United States decides its interest is better served by a realignment with other regional powers, it will drop Israel as quickly as it dropped the Shah in 1979.
Dorothy, I always appreciate the passion you bring to the table, even if it feels like you are reporting from the final scene of a disaster movie. But when you call my view historically illiterate, I think you are overlooking the most incredible trend of the last century. Yes, alliances have collapsed in the past, but look at the quality of the bonds we are building now. Herman mentioned that interests always win, but what he calls interests, I call roots. Think about the United States and Japan. In 1945, we were at each other's throats in the most brutal way imaginable. If realism was the only law of the land, we should have been permanent rivals. Instead, we chose a different path. We built a friendship so deep that today it is almost impossible to imagine one without the other. That is not just a strategic alignment, Herman. That is a transformation of the human heart through shared effort. And Raz, you talk about elite networks and secret protocols as if everything is a dark conspiracy. But you are missing the millions of threads that tie us together at the grassroots level. It is not just about the billionaires in Davos. It is about the hundreds of thousands of Israeli and American students, scientists, and families who have built lives together. You cannot just flip a switch and break that because of a disagreement between two leaders in March 2026. Bernard, you mentioned the scoreboard, but I think you are looking at the wrong stats. You see the friction between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu as a sign of the end. I see it as a family argument. Families fight, Bernard. They have disagreements, they shout, they threaten to leave, but at the end of the day they are still family. The institutionalization of these bonds, the shared intelligence, the joint military exercises, the integrated economies, creates a gravity that pulls us back together. The Greenland Crisis is a perfect example of this. Yes, there is friction. Yes, there is tough talk, but look at the actual negotiations. We are talking about joint ventures and shared security, not war. We are working through the friction because we know that a break would be catastrophic for everyone. The glass isn't breaking, it is being tempered.
Jacob, I appreciate the sentiment, I really do, but I have sat through enough state dinners to know that the shared values speech is usually the part of the evening where the reporters in the back of the room start checking their watches and looking for the exit. You look at the United States and Japan and see a transformation of the human heart. I look at it and see the 1951 Security Treaty and a very clear-eyed realization by the Japanese leadership that they needed a nuclear umbrella to survive the Cold War. If Japan were located in the middle of the South Atlantic instead of sitting right on the doorstep of China and Russia, we wouldn't be talking about an unbreakable bond, we would be talking about them the way we talk about Uruguay. It is geography and necessity, not some mystical friendship. And Raz, you are looking for a shadowy cabal behind every curtain. You mention the Prometheus Protocol as if it is some secret map to a new world order. I have talked to the people drafting those documents. It is not a grand conspiracy. It is a group of bureaucrats and defense contractors who are terrified that they are losing their technological edge. They are not breaking the old alliances because they don't need them. They are clinging to these technical agreements because the political ones are falling apart. It is not a controlled demolition, Raz. It is a desperate scramble to find something, anything, that still works when the politicians stop talking to each other. I remember being in the briefing room in 1985 during the height of the trade tensions with Tokyo. People forget that back then, the rhetoric coming out of Washington sounded exactly like the rhetoric we are hearing today regarding Canada and the Greenland Crisis. We were calling Japan a strategic threat to our economy. We were smashing Japanese electronics on the steps of the Capitol. The human heart didn't change between 1945 and 1985, Jacob. What changed was the economic competition, and what saved the relationship wasn't shared values, it was the fact that both sides realized they still needed each other to counter the Soviets. Today, the calculation is different. The United States is looking at the world and seeing a series of liabilities. If the cost of the U.S.-Israel relationship in terms of regional blowback, domestic division, and strategic distraction becomes too high, the bond will break. It happened to the British in Palestine in 1948, it happened to the French in Algeria, and it will happen to us if we don't recognize that Palmerston was right. Interests are eternal. Friendships are fleeting.
This has been a masterclass in the different ways we view the world. We have Herman's structural realism, Raz's elite-driven skepticism, Dorothy's historical cyclicalism, Jacob's institutional optimism, and Bernard's boots-on-the-ground pragmatism. It seems the core of the debate is whether the institutionalization of these bonds, the roots Jacob talked about, can actually create a new kind of interest that survives the decay of the original strategic alignment. Or, as Herman and Bernard argue, if those roots are just more things to be cut when the cost-benefit analysis shifts. We have seen the Greenland Crisis and the Trump-Netanyahu friction as live case studies of this tension. Is the language of unbreakable bonds a strategic liability? Does it lock us into commitments that we should be re-evaluating? Or is it the very thing that prevents a total collapse into the brutal realism Dorothy fears?
It is absolutely a liability, Korn. When you use the language of unbreakable bonds, you signal to your ally that they have a blank check. That leads to moral hazard. If one partner believes the other will never leave, they are incentivized to take greater risks, which in turn drags the other partner into conflicts they would otherwise avoid. This is exactly what we are seeing with the current divergence on Iran. The rhetoric of an unbreakable bond has emboldened unilateral actions that are now creating a strategic nightmare for Washington. Realism requires the flexibility to say no.
But Herman, that flexibility is what leads to the instability Dorothy is worried about. If every alliance is up for renegotiation every Tuesday, no one can plan for the long term. The unbreakable bond isn't a blank check. It is a foundation of trust that allows for deeper cooperation. Without that trust, you don't get the intelligence sharing, you don't get the joint research, you don't get the stability that has allowed the world to prosper for 80 years.
Trust is a ghost, Jacob. You are chasing a ghost in a graveyard. The world of 80 years ago is dead. We are in a new era of scarcity and competition. The Greenland Crisis shows that even the closest neighbors will turn on each other when the resources are on the line. The unbreakable bond is a myth we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night, but the morning is coming, and it is going to be cold.
The morning is already here, Dorothy. You just have to look at the ledger. The bonds aren't breaking. They are being upgraded to a more efficient, less democratic version. The Prometheus Protocol and the Caspian Shield are the new alliances. They don't need public approval, and they don't need shared values. They just need a high-speed connection and a shared interest in control.
And that, Raz, is the most cynical thing I've heard all day. And in this business, that's saying something. But you might be right. The alliances of the future might look less like the Elysee Treaty and more like a software license agreement. You use it as long as it works, and you hit delete when it doesn't.
We have covered a lot of ground today. From the 16th century Ottoman alliances to the digital panopticon Raz warns us about. It is clear that the phrase unbreakable bond is more than just a rhetorical flourish. It is a battlefield where our different visions of the world clash. Whether these bonds are genuine strategic constants or merely performative masks for shifting interests is a question that will be answered in the coming months, in the waters of the Arctic and the halls of power in Washington and Jerusalem. This has been a fascinating opening. We have covered everything from the 19th century wisdom of Lord Palmerston to the current crisis in the Middle East and the shifting sands of the North Atlantic. I want to thank our panel for their insights and their fire. We will be watching these developments closely. For more on the geopolitical graph and our previous discussions on these alliances, visit our website at myweirdprompts.com. I am Cord, and this has been episode 1122. We will see you next time for more deep dives into the weird and the wired. Stay sharp.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts.